It's connecting. Okay. Hi. Hello and welcome to the inaugural seminar in the Center for Gulf Studies at Exeter's virtual seminar series. I am, first of all, wanting to, I think, declare my solidarity with Palestinians that are undergoing extraordinary violence at the moment that we speak. I'm wearing the scarf and also my green and red in solidarity. It was a very considered outfit. And second, I really want to thank Sarah Wood, first of all, for helping out with all of the logistics in this and answering all my stupid questions as I was trying to organize this seminar series. And finally, immensely excited and grateful that Mohammed Al Sudairi will be our first speaker in the series, speaking about Cold War world making between East Asia and the Arab world. I met Mohammed many years ago in Hong Kong, of all places, and he took me to some really excellent, I think it was Xinjiang food that you took us to, and it was a really incredible experience, and it has been extraordinary following your trajectory and the research that you've been doing, and so it's very exciting for us to have you present your talk. The format of the talk is going to be what we're copying from our colleagues in the Center for Islamic Studies, Center for the Study of Islam, where Mohammed is going to talk briefly about his own experience of how he came into the research project, but also into the sort of the academic guild of which we're all a member. And then after that, he's going to present. He's got a fantastic PowerPoint, which I saw a couple of images, and it's going to look really great. And then after that, we're going to open the floor to questions and answers. When we're essentially opening the floor to questions and answers, I'll cease the recording so you can ask without any worries about your question being recorded. On that note, I will now stop talking and I will invite Mohammed to launch into his brilliance.
You're very kind, Lale. First of all, I'd like to also express my solidarity with Palestinians and what they're going through. I really wish that the talk was held under different circumstances. Now, having said that, I also wanted to express my thanks to you, Lale, for giving me this opportunity and platform to share some of my research, as well as to Sarah Wood for helping the logistics and organization. So I was asked to kind of maybe talk a bit about my own personal journey before kind of wading into the research and the project that I'm undertaking at the moment. So, I kind of reflected a bit on what I wanted to emphasize and talk about, namely how I got interested in kind of China-related research topics. And I would say that in terms of my intellectual trajectory, the early 2000s to the mid 2000s were very formative for me. I mean, I was kind of going through middle school and high school, and that was, that was happening at the backdrop of the global war on terror, which, the current kind of global discussions is triggering me to reflect on again. And also the American invasion of Iraq and the Israeli attack on Lebanon in 2006. I mean, all of these major events really kind of ignited in me an awareness and consciousness about the region as a whole, and kind of elicited in me a lot of questions about, well, how can we bring about an Arab or a pan-regional revival? What are the solutions to these problems, that are kind of geopolitical, but they're also entangled with a lot of domestic questions. And so when I was going through my undergrad education, which was in Doha, Qatar, in our third year, we had an opportunity to go on exchange somewhere in the world. I mean, the typical place that people went to was the United States. I actually had problems getting my visa prior to that, so I put a big X on the US. And there were other options available, Japan, Hong Kong. I decided to go to Hong Kong. I loved it. I enjoyed kind of the experience of learning a bit of Chinese. And I decided that once I finished my undergrad education, I would go to China. And of course, at that moment, this was the China of the Beijing Olympics of 2008. There was kind of an allure. And I think part of my attraction to it was really tied to a lot of the angst and the questions that had dominated my youth in the mid 2000s. Kind of seeing China as a possible model and a solution. And if I had to be very honest, I think, my thinking back then, and to some extent now, is still very state-centric or statist. So I kind of wanted to figure out what they had done successfully and what could be replicated in the Arab context. So I moved to Beijing. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have any connections in the city, but it was fantastic 3 years that I spent there. I mean, I studied Chinese, I did a master's, and I met all types of people. Palestinians who had gone to China in the 70s and 80s and were running cafes in Chaoyang district. Chinese Salafis who had graduated from the University of Medina, all types of randoms that I was kind of hanging out with. And that was very intellectually enriching. And it kind of jump-started this journey of engagement with different facets and aspects of China, whether in terms of its intellectual interactions with the Arab world, Chinese Muslims, particularly a focus on sectarianism, and kind of that all culminated in my pursuit of a PhD in the University of Hong Kong, kind of looking at the origins of ideological security and cultural engineering in the Arab and Chinese intellectual traditions going back to the 1920s onwards. So yeah, you could say that the starting point was really kind of a desire to locate or identify solutions to the Arab predicament, if we can phrase it that way. And through that journey, I kind of came to appreciate the complexities and problems within China itself, that the story was not as simple as I initially thought. And that, in fact, many of the debates we were having in our region were replicated in a Chinese context, albeit with its own particularities and whatnot. So while I've kind of moved away from thinking about China as a model, I do think of China as kind of a window into different intellectual horizons that has really enriched my life in very substantive ways. Maybe now I can talk a bit about the project. I'll share my screen. Okay, can everyone see the screen clearly, I hope? Okay, so what I'll be talking about today is kind of a snippet of my research looking at Arab imaginaries about China or the Sinophone world. So that includes China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and potentially other parts of the Chinese-speaking global communities. And what I'm going to be presenting to you today is really largely drawn from an article that had already come out with the Third World Quarterly about Arab encounters with Maoist China. Although, if time permits, I'll also try to draw a bit upon some of the material that I looked at for another article that's also going to be coming out as part of a special issue I had organized with Rosie Bashir from Harvard University on Cold War inter-Asian linkages. And this article specifically looks at kind of Saudi Arabia's anti-communist solidarities in East Asia during the 1950s and all the way into the 1980s. And I kind of look at some of the imaginaries that shaped the worldviews of some of Saudi Arabia's Cold War warriors, right, who were involved in kind of the anti-communist Asian people's meetings. Now, this general project, to put it simply, is really an attempt to map out the Arab intellectual imaginaries about the East through the 20th century and into the early 21st century. So while I'm looking at the Cold War specifically for today's talk, I should mention that I've been doing work on other junctures and periods. So, for instance, I've been working on an article that looks at, for example, the fantasy in the late 19th and early 20th century among Arab and Ottoman intellectuals of China becoming a Muslim kingdom or an Islamized polity. And this was kind of a very well entrenched narrative that you can see across many discursive spheres, right? And this article, which is tentatively titled Yellow Peril with a Dash of Green, will hopefully come sometime in a year or two, depending on the publication cycle. And I'm kind of looking ahead to do something on Cold War Islamists and their views of China, particularly people like Mohammed Kishk, kind of the communist turned Islamist from Egypt, who was a very important theoretician for a lot of different Islamist groups during the Cold War, but also Malik bin Nebi, the Francophone kind of Algerian intellectual. And I'm kind of interested in how a lot of these different thinkers draw from the Chinese Maoist political repertoire to kind of imagine political solutions of an Islamist tinge in the 20th century. So in many ways, you could say that this is a patchwork of different projects that look at different junctures, but the whole purpose of it is to think about how different Arab intellectual traditions have conceived and thought about China. And the reason why I'm interested in doing that really is that I think it's a useful exercise to kind of think more deeply about the Arab self through what these images tell us, because oftentimes they're not really about China and its realities as such, but really more about the predicaments and problems of Arab modernity and kind of Arab pathways into the future. So in that way, this project intersects with my own personal story. And I think it's also quite interesting to look at China specifically, because oftentimes with such work, kind of the mapping of the intellectual universes of the Arab world in the 20th century, it's oftentimes done in relation to the West. And I kind of want to maybe change the vantage point to see whether we can yield fresh readings about Arab intellectual life and kind of the key questions that animated it. And I think, maybe kind of an ancillary interest in doing this project is that I'm very interested in kind of complicating a bit the discussion on Chinese soft power, because if you look at a lot of the debates today, like from think tanks, from research institutions, especially Anglophone ones, it's oftentimes about China projecting kind of a particular narrative, China narrating its own story, and kind of imposing these tales and these perceptions of it among global audiences. But what I'm kind of interested in is, okay, what are some of the genealogies at play that kind of shape Arab receptivities, if one could argue that there are such receptivities to begin with, in dealing or engaging with Chinese narratives? What resonates and why? And what is also forgotten in terms of this long-standing or century-long Arab engagement with China in the contemporary debates and ways of thinking about China as a risen power. And, just to give you a very small example of kind of the parallels that I see is an excellent scholar by the name of Kyle von de Haddad had written a great piece for us at the King Faisal Center. And in it, he kind of compares the contemporary writings of Arabs who had gone on government organized tours to Xinjiang. And he compares it with the travel logs from the 1950s of Arabs who had gone to China and had done similar tours. And the parallels are uncanny, right? So it's kind of like there are echoes of the past, there are continuities, and it's interesting to kind of identify and map them out. And I should say that, these types of projects are quite useful in terms of, again, having these kind of fresh readings, changing or shifting the gaze is very critical. So some of the work that has really inspired this overall project are things like Renee Waringer's work on Ottomans imagining Japan. I mean, actually, there's a very large literature that looks at how Meiji Japan in the late 19th, early 20th century was imagined in the Middle East. What tends to be forgotten, though, is that oftentimes these imaginaries or fantasies surrounding Japan are also tied with particular imaginaries about China. So for instance, just again to highlight this point, this project about kind of the yellow peril with a dash of green, what a lot of that literature on Japan focuses on is the idea of Japan becoming a Muslim power, right? And there's kind of all these narratives, for instance, by Ahmed Al-Girgawi, a journalist who supposedly attended a fictitious conference in 1906 or 1907 that was hosted by the Japanese emperor to choose a national religion for Japan. And what's particularly interesting in such narratives is the presumed role that Chinese Muslims could play in bringing about the transformation of Japan religiously, and that they would also facilitate Japan's conquest of China, creating kind of an Eastern Muslim imperium, right? So it's interesting to kind of reinscribe China into these narratives that are in and of their own right quite interesting, because again, Meiji Japan kind of symbolized a non-Western power that had successfully produced modernity and had defeated a Western power, namely Russia, in the 1904-1905 war. And again, there are many similar intellectual projects. For example, looking at Afro-American engagement with Maoist China. I've also added this particular book. It's a bit of an old one and a classic, but I really enjoyed it, about the fellow travelers. And it looks at kind of these foreign communities of leftist leaning or leftist sympathizing intellectuals who had gone to the Soviet Union as well as to Maoist China. And again, that gaze, it was very enriching because it spoke to the experiences of a lot of the Arab intellectuals that I look at who had actually gone to China, for instance, and had produced very similar discourses. And you can see kind of the blinkers that exist in terms of their analysis and thinking about China. So this is kind of the overall outline of the project, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions about it. So maybe now, for the coming 40 minutes or so, I'll jump into the topic itself, with a particular focus on kind of Arab imaginaries of Maoist China. And if we get a chance, we'll also see what the right-wingers are saying. Not specifically about Maoist China per se, but nationalist China. So a lot of the literature that I looked at from the 1950s and 1960s is really from the genre of travel logs, right? These were kind of written by people who had gone to China for 2 to 3 weeks, usually on a government invitation, and kind of wrote about their superficial experiences. And this genre of work has often held a very admiring and very positive tone about China post 1949, the People's Republic. And there's kind of constant expressions of admiration for China achieving a type of post-colonial modernity, and that it utilized very much successfully a revolutionary repertoire to bring about this outcome. And this type of genre of literature was very popular across the Arab world. I mean, you find titles from Egypt, from Syria, from Iraq, and typically they were produced after a country had normalized relations with China or in the lead up to it, because that kind of coincided with a juncture of normalization and trying on the part of the CPC, the Communist Party of China, to win over supporters from those countries. And I think, kind of a very good and representative work of this genre is Ghassan Kanafani, the assassinated Palestinian novelist and poet who had gone to China in 1965 and wrote kind of a serial observations, or a series really, that was published in the PLFP journal in Beirut. Not only about his experiences in China, but also India and Thailand. And that was, titled "And Then Asia Shined," ثم أشرقت آسيا. And in it, you kind of encounter a lot of the kind of themes that I had mentioned with regards to admiration for Chinese modernity and revolution. That text, much like the other texts, gives very interesting descriptions about the places that people had gone to on these journeys, particularly, for instance, the Chinese Northeast, the Dongbei, which is kind of the Maoist industrial center of that period, going to, of course, the major urban centers such as Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing, Guangzhou. Usually they had very detailed descriptions, for instance, of cultural palaces, Heritage sites that had been preserved by the communist government. Here on the left, for example, are some of the Arab visitors in the Shihu Lake in Hangzhou, enjoying it. But oftentimes there was a particular focus on showcasing socialist industry and factories, again, as I'd mentioned, in the Northeast, but not just in the Northeast, all across China. This particular picture is quite unique because it actually is one of the few photos that I was able to locate of Nasser Said, who was a Saudi dissident from the 1950s. He participated in some of the demonstrations in Aramco and elsewhere in the country, and then he fled to Lebanon. And he was later assassinated. I'm not sure what was the date, whether it was 1975 or 1979, and there's a lot of accusations about who exactly assassinated him. But he was very active in producing a lot of kind of oppositional literature against the Saudi state. And in the 1950s, through the Arab Trade Union delegation that went to Russia and to China, he ended up going there. So this is kind of his picture there. I mean, and actually it's kind of a funny episode because it led to a lot of news, or rather fake news at the time, that the Saudi government was about to recognize the People's Republic, which the Egyptian press had reproduced. Of course, the Chinese state did not just showcase kind of these modern and cultural sites to these Arab onlookers. It tried to also tailor what they saw. Right. So, for instance, it took a lot of them to Arabic departments in places like Peking University. Here we have some of the Arab visitors with Ma Jian, who was a very famous graduate from Al Azhar and Chinese scholar of the Hui ethnicity, who was very important in who produced a translation of the Quran, and is kind of a very well-known Arabist figure in China. Of course, other places that people were taken to were Islamic sites. So particularly during the Cultural Revolution, one of the primary sites that people were taken to was the Dongsa Mosque, which was really the only site operating from that period, from 1966 all the way to 1976. And of course, it was particularly significant because that was the site of the government-controlled non-governmental organization, GONGO, the Islamic Association of China. So it was kind of one of the ways in which the state sold the narrative that it was still treating Muslims well, and that there were no problems or predicaments facing Muslims religiously. I mean, I should note that a lot of the people in these travel logs, for example, mentioned that they requested visiting the northwest of China or other places with Muslim majorities. They were dissuaded from that. And of course, sometimes, these types of attempts, which are again related in a lot of these travel logs, weren't always successful because some of the Arabs who visited China were themselves not Muslim. So they would end up taking Christians or atheists or Druze, and they would ask them to, for example, give a sermon to the gathered congregation, with very kind of funny miscommunication emerging as a result. Now, of course, the focus of a lot of these authors was not just simply on kind of the material achievements of the Chinese state. There was actually a lot of interest, for instance, in terms of how the state elevated the population through various different institutions, communes, prisons. Prisons were actually a site that people were taken often to, museums and the like. And that the state actually managed to successfully uplift a largely peasant population, right? So there was actually a lot of admiration expressed to the interventionist policies of the People's Republic, and kind of creating a population that was revolutionary, industrious, and kind of non-frivolous, right? Not distracted by entertainment and other things. So these are kind of some of the images I got in from one of the books. You have these very interesting contrasts between the decadence of colonial Hong Kong, right, with kind of a Hong Kong woman in a qipao, right, with a cigar and clanking alcohol glasses with a Western sailor. So there's a lot of like implicit claims being made there, contrasted, of course, with the girl from Canton, Guangzhou, who's wearing, the Maoist fatigues and kind of dedicating her time to the industrial buildup of China, or the new China. And of course, some of the images are also very much tongue-in-cheek, right, about kind of brainwashing and refashioning and creating the new man. But I should mention that with very few exceptions, the tone that existed across many of these works, and Ghassan Kanafani's work is very much representative of that, was extremely positive, right? And even Ghassan Kanafani, you can see that there's kind of also a constant reflection and conversation with Western press coverage of Maoist China, would constantly rebuke and claim that a lot of what was being said in Western press was complete lies. Like, for example, he came at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. There was actually widespread crackdowns against religious life, not just for Muslims, but Christians, Buddhists, and other communities. But, after going to the Dongsa Mosque and talking to, I think it was Imam Da Pushang, it could be, I'm not sure if he was still alive at that point, but he kind of said, yeah, this was all complete lies. So you can see that there is a kind of narrow conception of China that was quite superficial and, quite understandable in many ways. Now, having said that, there were individuals who give us much more intimate understandings and visions of China that are a lot more complicated. And these individuals were mostly people who came as foreign experts, so these were people who were recruited by the Chinese state to essentially act as, kind of editors, language polishers for propaganda tracts that were being produced in Arabic and were directed at the Arab world. So one particularly interesting individual who ended up going was Hanna-Mina. Hanna-Mina is a very famous Syrian communist novelist who actually lived in many parts of the world, Hungary, I think, elsewhere, but also stayed in China in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. So actually coinciding roughly with the Great Leap Forward, which he touches upon in his writings. And he produced a really fascinating trilogy called Hadatha fi Baytahu, which is Beidaicha, which is kind of the summer resort close to Beijing. Traditionally, foreigners were allowed to go there, but also it was a site for the gathering of the Communist Party leadership. Actually, even today, the Communist Party leadership gathers there during the summer, and a lot of the important political decisions are made there at that seaside resort. But this trilogy is actually kind of more of an autobiography about his life, albeit in a fictional depiction. It talks about kind of this young Arab communist who's a bit of an alcoholic and a womanizer who escapes from Lebanon because of political persecution and ends up coming to China. And he talks about kind of the extreme isolation that he faced there, because of course the foreigners were limited to staying in kind of these compounds. For example, the Yoi Bingguan, the Friendship Hotel, which was a big complex that housed hundreds of people in the Haidianchu, or the northwest district of Beijing. And there were similar complexes, for example, in Shanghai. And their lives were quite privileged, but heavily controlled. So for instance, a lot of the people who came as foreign experts were not allowed to leave the parameters of the city of Beijing, and they were actually limited to a certain area. In addition, they always had to be accompanied by someone. Fraternization with the Chinese population at large was quite limited. And as a result, a lot of them didn't actually have much in the way of Chinese proficiency. What's interesting in the work of Hanna-Mina is that he really paints kind of this sympathetic but somewhat critical vision of China, in the sense that he is someone, he comes as a cadre representing an undeclared communist party. In the novel itself, it's the Lebanese Communist Party. And this individual, this fictional character, decides to split or leave his party because in 1960, the Sino-Soviet split erupts. So what happens is that much of the Arab communist parties decide to side with the Soviet Union, and they recall a lot of these foreign experts who are actually cadre members of their parties back home. Now the actual main protagonist decides to stay, And the novel shows the tensions in terms of his decision, where he's sympathetic to the Soviet Union, but also to Maoist China, and doesn't really want to take a particular stance about it. But the novel also shows kind of this awareness of the Great Leap, in the sense that he's kind of critical of a lot of the egregious wastage that was taking place within the complex, where a lot of these foreigners were living relatively privileged lives, while the population kind of was suffering from starvation far away. I mean, this was at least what was coming to him on the grapevine. I should also say, and this is maybe a point I hadn't mentioned earlier, is that the sexualization of the Chinese woman really comes to the forefront in this trilogy. Because oftentimes, in a lot of the works from the 1950s and 1960s, the androgeneity of the Chinese population was emphasized. So kind of people desexualized them because, everyone was wearing these Maoist fatigues. Women did not put on makeup. There was not an attempt to highlight femininity. So you have a lot of these interesting travel logs, with some of them that kind of are borderline creepy, where they're kind of fantasizing and thinking about, whether these women have lovers, whether they have husbands. And there's one particular guy who keeps asking these questions to the woman accompanying him. I mean, it's actually quite interesting. A lot of these travel logs, the minder was oftentimes a woman who spoke Arabic, right? And some of them kind of fantasize about that, and some of them kind of ignore that point. But Hanna Mina's trilogy, sex really comes to the forefront, and it comes kind of as a taboo topic, where the main character falls in love with his minder. And, of course, it's illegal to do so. And he talks extensively about kind of meeting her many, many meters into the sea, where, because they're by the seaside on the beach. So they would swim in a dark night, and then they would rendezvous and talk about love and other things. So in some ways, it's a really interesting trilogy, because it talks about kind of the problems facing the Arab leftist project, in a way, in the sense that the protagonist is kind of a failed individual who lives in exile and feels very frustrated with the revolution back home, but also with his own development and kind of how he's wasting his time doing a lot of frivolous things and having this privileged life. But it's also about the problems associated with choosing sides in the Cold War, or the intra-Cold War in the case of the socialist camp. So it's a rather fascinating piece. Just these are some images of some of the material that the foreign experts worked with. A lot of them worked for China Pictorial, Suwar Muslim, China Reconstructs, Bina Scene. I mean, these were things that were very popular and distributed all across the Arab world. Other texts are like kind of the revolutionary operattas by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. Here it's Al-Istila على جبل النمر بدهاء, capturing the Tiger Mountain. Also the series of Mao's selected works. These are the first 4 volumes, which I believe were done by Mohammed Al Sudairi, who I haven't been able to collect much information about, except by kind of a few oral interviews. He's a Sudanese communist who broke with his party in the 1960s because of a failed coup that he was a part of. He was kind of part of the Maoist wing, and then he left to China, and he stayed there for 20 or 30 years. And presumably the Arabic selected works, the first 4 volumes, which are really the most important ones, were edited by him. Again, this is, I wish there was more information. Maybe it's out there, but I haven't been able to locate it. So what I talked about previously was kind of the general landscape of the different types of Arab imaginaries about China. A lot of them were kind of very superficial. They took a lot of the achievements of the revolution at face value. And a lot of their focus was really on material culture, as well as kind of, to some extent, state-societal relations. But I want to maybe talk a bit about the imagining of China as a model for the reconstruction of man and society at a much more substantive ideological and ethical level, right? Because a lot of the Arab writers that I talked about, for instance, when they talk about brainwashing, they just take it as a direct process. That just succeeded. They managed to clean the slate. They have achieved a cultural revolution in mind, but they don't really dwell on the particulars that they could bring back to the Arab world as such, right? So I want to maybe talk a bit about two intellectuals that I found to be quite fascinating in terms of their in-depth examination and thinking about China and kind of what that tells us about the Arab world as a whole. So the first one is Salama Ubaid. Salama Ubaid is a fascinating poet and teacher from the Suwaidat Mountains in Syria, very well accomplished for his time as an author. And he went to China first in 1965 for the Afro-Asian Writers Conference that was held in Beijing. At the backdrop of kind of the beginning of the Vietnam War. That was kind of the big issue in that conference. And he's kind of interesting because he's not only someone who came to China on a short-term visit, which led to the production of the Sharq al-Ahmar, the Red East, Dongfanghong, but also eventually returned to China and stayed there for 12 years as a foreign expert. So we have actually a very large corpus of writings, not only the travel log, but also his poetry and other kind of observations and ruminations about the China question in his mind. And what's rather fascinating is that Salama Ubaid, he talks about kind of the material achievements, but what he's really interested in is how did China reshape Chinese society? And he delves kind of an extensive amount into that. And he kind of says, well, China is this type of monastic state that has enforced a type of leftist religious fundamentalism. The term that he uses is Wahhabi leftism, Wahhabiyya Yasariya, which is really, really interesting term, because usually when people conjure the word Wahhabi, it's a very derogatory term, especially from outside of the peninsula. But here he's kind of using it in a way to describe China as almost this ascetic or Protestant state that is self-negating and very much focused on achieving a utopian afterlife, right, by forgoing the material now. And that the ways that they achieved this was really through the usage of art as a revolutionary tool, right? He actually spends quite a significant amount in this book saying, how the Chinese got rid of a lot of their bourgeois music, and they were focused mostly on using revolutionary music, revolutionary theater, revolutionary art forms to shape societal attitudes. And he contrasts that negatively with what was happening in Egypt, where people, even though under the Nasserite regime, were still listening to Ismahan and Kulthum, and there was kind of this romanticism that needed to be expunged in the Arab spirit, so that a kind of an Arab revolution could be achieved. And of course, he also dwells on other things that are quite interesting. Like, for example, he's very much interested in China's management of minorities. And he kind of posits that as a possible model for dealing with the Kurds in the creation of a pan-Arab state, with the Berbers. So he's kind of mining China for a lot of possible solutions towards the construction of a pan-Arab superstate. Because again, Salama Ubaid, if we kind of want to put him somewhere along the ideological spectrum, he was very much a pan-Arabist of the Nasserite classical quality. I mean, a lot of his poetry is also Nasser-centric, and on his death in 1970 and so forth, he has a very beautiful eulogy about him. I should mention before moving away from Salama Ubaid that he is particularly important in terms of the study of the Arabic language in China, because he was a foreign expert in Peking University, and he worked on a project throughout the 1970s to create the first authoritative Chinese Arab dictionary. Now, of course, there were dictionaries that had been produced previously, but this was the largest one with kind of formal or official support. And if you get the 2-volumed dictionary, which is really huge, he is mentioned as really the only foreigner who had participated in its production, right? So he is really associated with a big contribution to the development of the Arabic language. This is an image of him in Peking University. I think the individual next to him is Abdurrahman al-Buluhi, who is another foreign expert. Again, I would have liked to talk a bit about him, but I wanted to jump to someone else. But Abdurrahman al-Malouhi is another Syrian kind of novelist and writer who actually made a lot of contributions towards the translation of Vietnamese revolutionary literature into Arabic, primarily from French and English. I mean, one has to remember that the majority of these travelers to China, which is a really key point that needs to be emphasized, couldn't speak Chinese. And none of them actually, or very few of them, made an effort to learn Chinese. So this actually underscores the point that I mentioned, that oftentimes their imaginaries about China are really about the Arab self, because they're projecting fantasies onto an other that they couldn't really fully access. The next kind of individual, or the second individual I wanted to talk about, which I find super fascinating, is Hadi al-Alawi. Hadi al-Alawi is a Iraqi Marxist, really unusual. I mean, even the people who had met him in China have a lot of different stories about him, right? And kind of his lifestyle, his demeanor, his way of engagement with people. But he's I would describe him as a spiritual Marxist, in the sense that while he was born to a Muslim family, he continued and he abjured Islam after he became kind of a Marxist. I mean, he joined the Communist Party, but then he left because he couldn't agree with a lot of their policies and approaches, but he retained that kind of Marxist outlook. He nevertheless continued to affirm and assert the importance of Islam as kind of an important tradition that Marxism had to engage with, at least in the Middle Eastern context. And he was kind of he's of the same intellectual background as Hussein Mrouwa. Hussein Mrouwa is a Lebanese kind of Marxist who was also interested in kind of mining the Arab classical corpus, or the Muslim classical corpus from the Umayyad, Abbasid eras, etc., to identify sources that could be used in Marxist analysis and realizing a Marxist interpretation, and also kind of realizing a Marxist revolution. So Hadi al-Alawi ended up going to China in the early 1980s. And he went actually through the efforts of Jalal al-Hanafi. Jalal al-Hanafi is, again, a person that I would really like to do more research about, really fascinating, a very famous religious scholar in Baghdad, a musician, a historian of the city and its folklore. And he ended up, weirdly enough, going to China as also a foreign expert. His whole period coincided exactly with the Cultural Revolution of 10 years. And he stayed in Shanghai. And what makes him particularly unique, Jalal al-Hanafi, not only his background, is that he was probably one of the few foreign experts to learn Chinese. And it's reported in different sources that he actually developed a system to transcribe Chinese using Arabic lettering, kind of an equivalent of the pinyin system with Latin alphabet, and that he had also invented a typewriter for rendering Chinese and Arabic text. But presumably he had lost it on the way back to Iraq. But in any case, because of his contact with the Iraqi embassy and his friendship with Hadi al-Alawi, he had recommended him to the Chinese embassy when they were looking for a replacement. So Hadi al-Alawi ended up going to China for two distinct periods. I mean, he was himself an anti-Ba'athist and escaping from the persecution from Saddam Hussein's regime. It's interesting, actually, because Hadi al-Alawi, his brother, was a Ba'athist media specialist, right? So, I mean, they took very different trajectories as brothers. In any case, Hadi al-Alawi, who really talks about his life or his intellectual journey as divided up into two periods, the pre-China and the China period, had a very transformative experience there. And in some ways, it really resonates with me. I mean, his time in Beijing was spent reading a lot of the Arab classics, Al-Insan al-Kamil, for example, by Imam al-Ghazali, and many other works. And he actually began to write a lot of his substantive material during his stay in China in the early 1980s, and then when he came back in the early 1990s. And Hadi al-Alawi kind of saw that Eastern civilizations, namely the Chinese and the Islamic civilizations, kind of shared in a similar structural makeup, right, in terms of their means of production and kind of their overall political economies, the base and the superstructure, in which they were societies that had feudalism to some extent, but it was feudalism that was checked by the existence of strong states on the one hand, but also religious traditions that limited the excesses of this feudalism. And it kind of led to the production of modes of existence that are more akin to communalism, masha'iyya, he calls it. So you could actually say that if you think about kind of the different stages of production, during the Stalinist period, and even I think other Marxist theoreticians, there was a whole debate about whether there was an Asian mode of production, right? For him, Islamic and Chinese civilization had an Asian mode of production, and that was actually quite positive, as opposed to kind of being an impediment to further development of these societies towards capitalism and then towards communist future. And he says that actually the strongest repositories for these communalisms in China and the Islamic world respectively is Taoism and Sufism, and that these traditions are actually quintessentially communalistic and oriented towards the people. And he says, well, you can see that in terms of a lot of the intellectual figures that emerged from these different traditions. He looks at Lao Tzu, for example, from Taoism, the mythical founder. He has, of course, a long name of individuals from the Sufi tradition, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and so forth, but he also includes people like Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, who is kind of a free thinker from the 10th century, a blind poet, who was also a very strict vegetarian, which incidentally enough, also Hadi al-Alawi was a strict vegetarian. And also people like Karl Marx, Goethe from Germany. He says that, these people encapsulate the ethos of this Eastern civilizational inheritance of communalism. In the case of Karl Marx, he argues that's because of his Jewishness. And in the case of Goethe, it's because he was kind of very heavily influenced by Oriental traditions, right? And his engagement with that scholarship and whatnot. Now, in terms of China, just to conclude and maybe touch upon the right-wingers very quickly, is Hadi al-Alawi argued that the reason why the Chinese Revolution had succeeded was because that the Communist Party did not turn away from this communalistic ethos within its civilization. He said that actually they kind of Marxified Taoism or Taoified Marxism, right? So in many ways, their Marxist practice is an expression of an already existing cultural edifice that they did not reject, right? And I think this is really important because this is actually Hadi al-Alawi's critique to the whole Arab leftist experience, right? Because he says that the biggest problem as to why the leftist project had failed in the Arab world from the 1960s onwards is that it always sought to directly translate communist or leftist experiences. So they were trying to replant the Russian, Cuban, Vietnamese, or Chinese experiences in the Arab world when there was actually a need to Arabify or Islamify Marxism. And that required kind of engaging with local traditions, right? I mean, as I said, he himself was not necessarily a devout Muslim, but he did see that it did not make sense to turn away from an already pre-existing spiritual and cultural tradition that was there, right? And that this cultural tradition is what made kind of these Eastern spaces humanistic, as opposed to, say, the West. I mean, he has a very essentialized look at the West as kind of a source of barbarism that comes from its Greco-Roman past, etc. But this is kind of an important point. And he says that all the excesses that happened in China later on, whether it's the Great Leap Forward, the Communist Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, all of those were excesses and violence caused by China turning away from its cultural legacy and kind of adopting Stalinism, right? Again, this makes Hadi al-Alawi very unique because he's kind of an original thinker who's not really just receiving whatever his Chinese interlocutors say. I mean, if you look at a lot of the Arab travel logs that were written in the 1960s, they took the Cultural Revolution at face value as a categorical good. Right, so he had a kind of a very in-depth engagement that was rather fascinating. And I should conclude by talking about Hadi al-Alawi by saying that he really contributed to the sinological tradition in the Arabic language. He translated, for example, the Tao Te Ching, the book of the Tao. And he also wrote a wonderful book called the Book of Chinese Novelties, which is really fascinating, kind of a sketch of Chinese history and other things. So yeah, I think I'm kind of running out of time. So this always happens. I never get to the right wingers, which is a big problem. But I'll stop here. If someone wants to ask a question about the right wingers, I think they deserve to be heard. They are part of the Cold War story. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I'm gonna stop the recording now and then open the floor to questions. So I'm gonna stop the recording. Okay.